On a night when the wind cut like a blade and the snow fell without mercy, 68-year-old Arthur Briggs stood at the gates of Millhaven County Animal Shelter, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the knot on the leash. Beside him, a large German shepherd, scarred, one-eared, his amber eyes full of something no animal should ever have to feel, pressed his flank against Arthur's leg with every ounce of strength he had. Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded $5 bill, the last $5 to his name, and a handwritten note he'd spent an hour writing and rewriting at the kitchen table. His handwriting had deteriorated from the tremors, but the words were clear enough. My name is Max. My owner has cancer and can no longer care for me. Please don't put him down. He served this country. So did I. Arthur Briggs, U.S. Army Ret. He tucked the note and the bill into the pouch of Max's collar. Max understood. He always understood. He gripped the hem of Arthur's coat in his teeth, gently, the way he'd been trained never to bite a person, but firmly enough to say, "Please, don't." Arthur pried the dog's jaw open with trembling fingers. He pressed his forehead against Max's for a long moment. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Then he turned and walked back into the storm. Max's howl followed him for 3 blocks. He never looked back. But 3 days later, the phone rang in Arthur's hospital room. And what it told him, what Max had done, would shake the entire town of Millhaven to its rotten core. The diagnosis had come 6 weeks earlier on a Tuesday, which Arthur had always considered the dullest and most pointless day of the week. He'd driven himself to the county clinic, sat in a plastic chair that was too small for a man who'd once carried 60 pounds of field equipment through the mountains of Afghanistan, and listened to a young doctor with kind eyes tell him that the mass in his lung was malignant, advanced, and aggressive. Stage 4. The young doctor had used the word options, but Arthur had heard the word beneath it, time. As in, how much of it was left? The treatment, immunotherapy, targeted radiation, a clinical drug trial that represented his best statistical hope, would cost somewhere in the range of $40,000 out of pocket after his military insurance coverage maxed out. Arthur had driven home, sat at his kitchen table, and opened his bank account on the cracked screen of his old laptop. $9.42. He'd closed the laptop. Max had put his head in Arthur's lap immediately, as he always did when something was wrong. Arthur had sat there for a long time, one hand resting on the dog's broad skull, staring at the wall. He'd made his decision by midnight. The night he chose to bring Max to the shelter, the storm had already been building for 2 days. The Weather Service had called it a once-in-a-decade blizzard, the kind that closed schools and grounded flights and turned the mountain roads into rivers of ice. Arthur had waited, not because he was hoping to change his mind, but because he'd wanted one more day. Just one more. He'd cooked the last piece of chicken in the refrigerator, a single breast he'd been saving for something he couldn't remember, and placed it in Max's bowl without hesitation. He himself ate 4 crackers and a can of soup with the label peeling off. He sat on the floor next to Max while the dog ate, the way he had in the early days when Max was too skittish to eat unless Arthur was close enough to touch. Max ate every bite. Then he looked at Arthur. Those eyes. God, those eyes. Max was 8 years old, ancient for a working dog. He'd served 4 years with a military police unit in Kandahar before an IED explosion during a patrol had ended his service. The blast had taken his left ear clean off and peppered his left flank with shrapnel scars that had never entirely healed over. It had also done something to his mind that no veterinary report could fully quantify. He'd come home from overseas the same way a lot of soldiers did, changed, hypervigilant, prone to sudden, paralyzing terror at certain sounds, certain smells. But with Arthur, he was still. He was safe. They'd walked to the shelter through 3 inches of fresh snow, Max trotting at Arthur's heel the way he'd been trained, occasionally pressing against the old man's leg when a gust of wind made Arthur stumble. The walk took 40 minutes. Arthur had to stop twice to catch his breath, leaning against utility poles while Max sat perfectly still at his feet, watching his face. The shelter was a long, low building on the edge of town, its wire fences barely visible through the snow. The main doors were locked at this hour. Arthur had known they would be. He'd chosen this time on purpose. If he had to look anyone in the eye, he wouldn't be able to do it. He tied Max's leash to the iron ring bolted to the post beside the door, the ring that was there precisely for situations like this, for the desperate, and the broken who came in the night. Max sat. He looked at Arthur with an expression of absolute trust that made something inside Arthur's chest crack down the middle. Arthur crouched, despite the pain it cost him, until he was at eye level with the dog. He put both hands on either side of Max's head. Max's one good ear swiveled forward. "You're going to be all right," Arthur said. His voice was steady. He had decided it would be steady, and it was. "You hear me? You're a good soldier. The best I've ever known. And you deserve better than a dead man who can't even buy you kibble." Max licked his face. Once. Deliberate. Careful. Arthur stood. He tucked the note and the $5 into the pouch on the collar with fingers that would not stop shaking. He checked the knot on the leash one last time. Then Max did it, gripped the hem of Arthur's coat in his teeth. Not hard, just enough. "Don't go." Arthur reached down and gently, deliberately worked the coat free from Max's teeth. He pressed his forehead to Max's one last time. He breathed in the smell of the dog, pine and cold air, and something warm underneath, something that had meant safety and companionship and the specific grace of being known for 3 years. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy." He walked away. Max's howl rose behind him, a sound of pure devastation, and followed Arthur for 3 blocks through the storm. He never looked back. If he had, he would not have been able to keep walking. Arthur Briggs had spent the better part of his life being left behind by things he loved. His wife, Helen, had died 7 years ago, breast cancer, 2 years from diagnosis to a winter morning when Arthur had woken to find the other side of the bed cold in a way it had never been before. They'd been married 31 years. He'd carried her photo in his front shirt pocket every day since, the laminated edge worn smooth from handling. After Helen, Arthur had done what he'd always done with pain. He'd turned inward. He'd sold the house in town, too many rooms full of her absence, and moved into the small cabin on the wooded edge of the county that he'd always kept as a hunting retreat. He stopped answering the phone. He stopped going to the VFW dinners he'd once enjoyed. He ate alone, slept alone, and spent his days in a silence so thorough that it sometimes felt like a kind of slow disappearance. His nephew Leo came by occasionally, though never without an agenda. His old army friends called less and less. For 2 years, Arthur occupied his days with small rituals of maintenance, chopping wood, mending the porch steps, tending the small vegetable garden that Helen had started, and he'd continued out of a loyalty he couldn't fully explain. He was not suicidal. He was simply diminishing, growing smaller around the edges, like a fire that hasn't been fed. Then, 3 years ago, he'd gone to the shelter to drop off a bag of supplies, canned food, old blankets, as he did twice a year. A kind of habit born from Helen, who'd volunteered there when she was alive. Dr. Sarah Chun had been on duty that day, a young veterinarian barely past her residency, with sharp dark eyes and a manner that reminded Arthur of the best junior officers he'd ever served with. Direct, competent, no wasted motion. She'd thanked him for the donation and then, almost as an afterthought, had said, "We have a dog you might want to see." She'd led him to a kennel at the far end of the building, separated from the others. The shepherd inside, enormous, scarred, with only one ear and a gaze that could stop a man in his tracks, had lunged at the gate when a staff member approached, snarling with the kind of controlled ferocity that was not anger, but terror. "He came back from AK, 9 Unit 8 months ago," Sarah had explained quietly. "His handler was killed in the blast that injured him. He's bitten 2 handlers here. He's on the list." Arthur had looked at the dog. The dog had looked at Arthur. Something passed between them that Arthur couldn't have described in language, though he'd tried to put it into words for Helen's photo later that night. The closest he'd come was this. It was like looking in a mirror, except the mirror was a dog. He'd asked Sarah if he could go in. She'd advised against it. He'd gone in anyway. Max had pressed against the far wall, hackles raised, every muscle coiled. Arthur had sat down on the floor of the kennel and done nothing. He hadn't spoken, hadn't reached out, just sat, for 20 minutes, for 30, until, with a caution so careful it was almost heartbreaking, Max had come forward and sniffed the top of Arthur's head. Arthur had been still as stone. Max had lain down 3 feet away and exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that sounded, absurdly, like relief. The paperwork to adopt him had taken 2 hours. Arthur had driven Max home in the passenger seat of his old truck, one hand on the wheel, one hand resting quietly on the seat between them. By the time they reached the cabin, Max had shifted over until his flank was warm against Arthur's thigh. The healing had been neither quick nor clean. Max flinched at loud sounds. A slamming door could send him under the bed. And for the first month, Arthur's nightmares sent Max spinning into the corners of the room, panting and wild-eyed. But they'd worked it out between them. Two broken things learning each other's edges, learning where to be careful and where it was safe to press. Arthur had learned that if he spoke to Max in the deliberate, even tone he'd used with young soldiers, calm, clear, certain, Max would settle. Max had learned that when Arthur woke at 3 in the morning from a dream of yellow sand and blood, the weight of a dog's head on his chest was the only thing that made the room feel real again. They didn't fix each other, not entirely, but they made each other functional. And sometimes, in the quiet of the cabin at the end of a long day, watching the fire burn down while Max dozed with his chin on Arthur's boot, Arthur had felt something he hadn't felt since Helen died. Not happiness exactly, but its architecture, the frame of a life worth living. Now that frame was empty again. Arthur walked home from the shelter in the blizzard, and he walked slowly because there was no longer any reason to hurry. He'd been back at the cabin for less than 12 hours when they came. He heard the truck before he saw it. Leo's modified pickup, the one he bought with money borrowed and never repaid. Its engine loud and ill-maintained the way Leo was loud and ill-maintained. It pulled up to the cabin at 10:30 in the morning, and Arthur heard 2 doors close. Leo and someone else. The someone else, when Arthur opened the door, was Sheriff Dale Miller. Miller was 50 years old and built like a man who had once been physically powerful and was now powerful in a softer, more dangerous way. He had a politician's handshake and a preacher's voice, deep, warm, calibrated to make you feel you were in the presence of someone who genuinely cared about your welfare. He wore his uniform with the precision of a man who understood that appearances were a form of authority. Half the county had voted for him 3 consecutive times. The other half had wanted to and just hadn't gotten around to it. Arthur had never liked him. He stood in the doorway and said nothing. Uncle Arthur. Leo came forward with his arms spread, the gesture of a man performing warmth rather than feeling it. He was 35 and handsome in an untrustworthy way, with their family's blue eyes and none of their family's spine. We heard you were sick. We came to help. Did you? Arthur said. Miller stepped up onto the porch without being invited, which Arthur noted and filed away. Arthur, I know this is a hard time. Leo's been real worried about you. We both have. He looked past Arthur into the cabin. Mind if we come in? It's cold out here. Arthur stepped back. Not out of welcome, out of calculation. They sat at the kitchen table. Leo placed a manila envelope on the table without preamble. Arthur didn't touch it. It's a property transfer agreement, Leo said. I've had a lawyer look at it. Everything's above board. You sign the cabin and the land over to me, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. There's a good memory care facility over in Bryan County. I don't have memory problems, Arthur said. I have cancer. Either way, Leo waved a hand. You can't manage the property. You can barely. He glanced at Arthur's shaking hands and chose not to finish the sentence. The land has been in your family for 40 years, Miller said, his tone shifting to something smoother, more dangerous. It'd be a shame to see it go to the county for back taxes. Or worse. He paused, letting the or worse do its work. I know some developers have been sniffing around this area. Eminent domain can move fast when a property becomes a liability. Arthur looked at Miller for a long time. Are you threatening me, Dale? Miller's smile didn't waver. I'm advising you, Arthur. As a friend, and as the law in this county. His eyes held Arthur's with a steadiness that was meant to communicate absolute certainty. I am the law in this county, and you have no one. Arthur pushed the envelope back across the table. Get out. The smile remained. Miller stood and buttoned his jacket with the careful deliberateness of a man making a point. Leo grabbed the envelope and followed him to the door, then turned. You're going to run out of time, old man, Leo said, and his voice had dropped the pretense entirely. The offer won't stay open forever. The door closed. Arthur sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the sound of the truck faded. His pills were on the counter, pain management, the only medication he could still afford, and he dry swallowed 2 of them without water. Then he went to the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers. Max's side of the bed was empty. He stared at the ceiling until the pills did their blunt and insufficient work, and then he slept. At Millhaven County Animal Shelter, The dog in Kennel 7 had not eaten in 36 hours. Dr. Sarah Chun had been watching Max since the moment the morning staff had found him tied to the gate post, his note and his $5 and his biography of suffering compressed into a collar pouch. She'd read the note twice. She'd held it for a moment after the second reading, looking at the sky. Then she'd taken Max inside, and he'd gone with her. Not easily, not without the constant vigilance that characterized every movement he made, but he'd gone. He'd gone into the kennel and turned to face the door, and he'd sat there. And that was where he stayed. He didn't eat the kibble. He didn't touch the water until Sarah, concerned about dehydration, sat on the floor outside his kennel for an hour and spoke to him in the low, even tone she'd learned made him least afraid. Only then did he go to the bowl, drink twice, and return to his post by the door. By the second night, Sarah was worried enough to run blood work. His numbers were fine. He was not ill. He was grieving, and she recognized the difference. She checked on him at midnight before going home. Max had been sitting at the gate of his kennel, his remaining ear forward, watching the main door with the specific attention of an animal that is waiting. "He'll come back," she told him, which was something she told every surrendered dog and did not entirely believe. Max had looked at her, and in that look, Sarah felt, with an irrational certainty she would not have been able to explain to a colleague, that Max knew Arthur was not coming back, and that he had no intention of waiting to be right. She'd left at 12:15 a.m. At 2:43 a.m., the shelter's motion sensor camera in the kennel corridor captured the following sequence of events. Max rose from his sitting position. He sniffed the latch of his kennel door, the standard sliding bolt that fastened from outside, for approximately 40 seconds, his nose moving across the mechanism with a methodical precision that was not panic but problem-solving. Then he sat back and appeared to think. He threw himself sideways at the kennel door, once, twice, 3 times, not frantic, but with a calculated, rhythmic force that was clearly aimed at the latch housing. On the 4th impact, the bolt, which the shelter's maintenance record showed, had been flagged for replacement 2 months ago and never fixed, sheared at its mounting point. The door swung open. Max walked out. He did not run. He paused in the corridor, inhaling the air with slow, systematic attention, mapping the building by scent. He walked to the far end of the hall, where an old sash window sat slightly above floor height, too high for most dogs, but not for a shepherd who'd spent 4 years clearing compounds. He stood on his hind legs and worked the single-pane glass with his muzzle until the aging frame gave. Then he was through, landing in the snow outside with a soft, heavy thud. His front left paw had been cut by the window frame. He paused, looked at it, and kept moving. In the snow, his tracks moved north, directly north, toward the forest road that led to the cabin on the hill that he had known as home. Behind him, in the narrow tracks, small dark spots in the white, blood from the cut paw, freezing almost as soon as it fell, leaving a trail as deliberate and unambiguous as a message. He had made his decision. He was going to find Arthur. He was going to bring him home. Max ran with the snow coming at him sideways, navigating by the topography of scent rather than sight, his nose parsing the white chaos into 100 specific information streams as naturally as a man reads a road sign. The forest road was familiar territory. He and Arthur had walked it dozens of times, in all weathers. He knew its turns by the smell of the creek that ran beside it, knew the 3-mile mark by the particular mineral odor of the limestone outcropping, knew Arthur's cabin by the wood smoke and the old motor oil and the specific, irreplaceable human scent that 3 years of living together had made as basic to Max's navigation as north on a compass. He covered the first 2 miles in good time, despite the snow and the cut paw that bled less as the cold numbed it. He was tired. 36 hours of not eating had taken something from him, but the concept of stopping did not enter his mind. It had been trained out of him, and in this case, training and love produced exactly the same result. It was near the 3-mile mark, at the edge of what local maps labeled the old Ridgeway mineral claims, a stretch of land pocked with abandoned test shafts from a failed mining operation 40 years past. That Max stopped. His nose had caught something. He stood still in the snow, head elevated, nostrils working in slow arcs. The scent was complex, multiple layers cataloged instantly by instinct and experience. The damp, cold metal smell of disturbed earth. Underneath it, human, more specifically, human hands that had touched this earth recently. And under that, the chemical sharpness of decomposing paper, and something denser with the faint waxy richness of currency. And under all of that, faint but unmistakable to an animal trained to detect it, the metallic ghost of gunpowder. Max's ear came forward. His body dropped into the low, precise posture of a working dog on a find. He moved off the road into the scrub, pushing through knee-deep snow toward a depression in the ground near the largest of the old mine shaft entrances. A shaft that had been sealed with corrugated steel decades ago. The seal now rusted and partially collapsed. The depression was maybe 3 feet from the shaft entrance, on the north side, where the natural curve of the slope created an overhang that would protect it from casual sight. He dug with the systematic efficiency of a dog who had spent 4 years searching compounds for buried explosive devices. The snow came first, 2 feet of it, compressed hard at the bottom. Then soft earth, worked recently, disturbed within the last several weeks. Then his teeth closed on the edge of a heavy-duty waterproof bag. Military surplus, the kind designed to keep maps and documents dry during river crossings. He'd seen them in service. He knew the texture. He pulled. It took 3 hard, backward scrambling pulls to drag the bag clear of the earth. It was heavier than expected, perhaps 12 pounds, and it landed in the snow with a soft, solid thunk. Max did not investigate the contents. That was not his job, and in some functional sense he understood this. His job was simple and ancient. He had found something significant in a place where his training told him significant things did not belong. And now his job was to take it somewhere that mattered. He gripped the bag's carry strap in his jaws, thick nylon, awkward, the weight of it making his head drop, and turned back toward the road. He had perhaps 5 miles left to go. He had no idea what the bag contained. He knew only that it reeked of secrets, and that secrets had a habit of belonging to the wrong people, and that Arthur, wherever Arthur was, needed him. He ran. Sheriff Dale Miller had made the drive to Ridgeway at 3:15 in the morning for the same reason he'd made the drive every month for the past 3 years, routine maintenance. The careful tending of the secret that was simultaneously the source of his power and, he was well aware, the mechanism of his eventual destruction if he ever lost control of it. The bag had been there since November, his most recent deposit, which was the word he used in his own mind for the process of extracting money from the Millhaven Veterans Medical Assistance Fund and routing it through a series of shell accounts before it arrived, clean and documented as administrative overhead, in his personal holdings. The bag contained 3 years of ledger records, not the public ones, but the real ones, the ones that showed the actual numbers, and approximately $60,000 in cash that needed to move before the county auditors ran their biannual review in spring. He'd chosen the Ridgeway shafts because no one came here. The land was zoned non-use. The trails had been closed since 2019, and the only people who ever drove this road at night were teenagers looking for a place to drink, who never ventured more than 50 yards from their cars. He parked where the road curved, killed the headlights, and climbed out with a shovel and a flashlight. He found the depression immediately. He'd been coming here long enough to know exactly where to look. He swept the flashlight across it. The snow was disturbed. The earth was disturbed. And there, caught in his flashlight beam like something from a nightmare, a large German shepherd stood 20 feet away in the snow, a waterproof bag hanging from its jaws, its one amber eye reflecting the light with absolute, unblinking clarity. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Drop it," Miller said. He was aware, even in the shock of the moment, of how absurd it was to command a dog. But the word came out of his law enforcement reflex before rational thought could intercede. Max did not drop it. Max ran. Miller fired twice into the tree line and ran back to his truck. He grabbed the radio, then put it down. He couldn't call dispatch. He couldn't explain what he was doing here at 3 in the morning with a shovel. He pulled out his personal cell phone instead and called the 3 men he paid to handle situations that couldn't go through official channels. "There's a dog," he said. "Big shepherd, one ear, carrying a bag. He's in the Ridgeway tree line heading north on the old mining road. I need him stopped. I need the bag." He paused. "I need this done in the next hour." He released his 2 hunting dogs from the bed of the truck, Chesapeakes, trained for recovery work, heavy and relentless in rough country. He pointed them toward the tree line and gave the command. They crashed into the forest after Max heard them before they were within half a mile of him. He'd operated under pursuit before, in the compounds of Kandahar, with men shouting and vehicles grinding behind him and his handler's voice in the earpiece telling him to go, go, go. The hunting dogs were fast, but they were following his trail, a straight line, which was predictable. His handler had spent a year teaching him never to run a straight line when pursued. He cut right, hard, into the deeper scrub, then doubled back in a long arc that brought him onto the ridge above the road. Higher ground, better cover, the bag's weight shifting and swinging as he moved, but never once touching the ground. He ran in a broken zigzag that would have been recognizable to any experienced tracker as the movement of an animal that had learned this from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He was bleeding more now, the paw, and a new cut from the brush, but he was pulling away. He ran toward Arthur. Arthur had been brought to Millhaven General at 11 the previous night. His neighbor, Earl Hutchins, a retired schoolteacher who occupied the next cabin 3/4 of a mile up the ridge, had called Arthur twice over 2 days and received no answer. On the second evening, he'd driven down and knocked, and when no answer came, he'd let himself in with the spare key Arthur had given him 3 years ago. He'd found Arthur on the floor of the bedroom, conscious but barely, his breathing a wet and labored sound that Earl had recognized from his own father's last days. He'd called 911. He'd held Arthur's hand during the ambulance ride. In the hospital, he'd given them Arthur's name and his own phone number and stayed until a nurse told him gently but firmly that there was nothing to do but wait. Arthur was in a private room on the 3rd floor, on oxygen and 4 fluids, his chart noting: stage 4 pulmonary carcinoma, acute exacerbation, possible pneumonia, severely malnourished. Prognosis: poor. He was not awake, but he was not quite gone. Sarah had been at the hospital since 9 that morning. Not for Arthur. She hadn't known he was there, but because Millhaven General had the county's only veterinary imaging equipment capable of handling large dogs, and she needed to run a scan on a retriever with a suspected splenic mass. She was eating a sandwich from the vending machine in the 2nd floor corridor when her phone rang. The shelter's overnight staff. Max was gone. She'd spent 2 hours driving the roads between the shelter and Arthur's cabin, calling his name from the window of her car the way you do when you know it's probably hopeless but cannot stop. She'd gotten back to the hospital at nearly 4 a.m. to retrieve her car, and she was standing at the reception desk updating her paperwork when someone at the front entrance said, "What the?" Max came through the emergency entrance at 4:23 in the morning, and he came at a dead run. He was barely recognizable. He was covered in blood, his own, from the paw and from at least 2 more lacerations across his flank that the brush and the hunting dogs had given him. His coat was matted with snow and ice, and his one amber eye was fixed forward with an expression of absolute, undeflectable concentration that silenced the room the way a sudden loud noise silences a room, completely, involuntarily. He carried the waterproof bag in his teeth. He moved through the lobby without deviation, without acknowledging the security guard who stepped toward him, without reacting to the shout that went up. Sarah recognized him and screamed his name. He glanced at her, one quick, acknowledging flick of his eye, and kept moving. Somehow he knew where to go. Later, people would argue about this. The scent, some said. Arthur's room was on the floor above, and ventilation systems carry more than we think. Others pointed to the cardiac monitor. Others said something they couldn't quite name, but that made the hair stand up on their arms when they tried to describe it. He went to the elevator. He stood in front of it. It opened, someone inside, stepping back against the wall with a strangled gasp, and Max walked in. 3rd floor. The doors closed. Sarah, running for the stairs, reached the 3rd floor in time to see Max moving down the corridor, his nose working, his direction certain. He stopped at room 312. He pushed the door open with his muzzle. Arthur lay in the bed, his face gray, the oxygen mask fogged with each shallow breath. His hand rested at his side, palm up, the way hands rest when their owner is no longer paying attention to them. Max walked to the bed. He placed the waterproof bag on the edge of the mattress, beside Arthur's hand, with a deliberateness and care that suggested he understood what fragile meant. Then, very slowly, his legs gave way. He collapsed against the side of the bed. The bag, balanced on the mattress edge, slid and fell. The zipper, partially opened during the night's running, gave way entirely, and the contents scattered across the tile floor of room 312. $60,000 in banded cash, spreading across a hospital floor like something from a dream. And on top of it, falling open to a page dense with figures and initials and dates, a black ledger. The night nurse who had followed Sarah down the hall stopped in the doorway. She looked at the money. She looked at the doc. She looked at the unconscious man in the bed. She picked up the wall phone and said, "I need security on 3, and I think you'd better call the county line." They arrived 40 minutes later. Sheriff Miller came in through the main entrance with Leo at his elbow, both of them moving quickly, Miller's expression calibrated to something between professional concern and helpful authority. He'd clearly come from the road. His boots were wet, and he was wearing civilian clothes with his badge and sidearm added hastily, like a costume assembled in emergency. He'd been listening to the police scanner. He'd heard the call. The hospital administrator, a nervous man named Dawes, met them at the elevator. Miller showed his badge and identified himself as the investigating officer on a possible evidence recovery situation involving a stray animal. Room 312 had acquired occupants since Max's arrival. Sarah was there, crouched on the floor beside Max, applying pressure to the worst of his lacerations with gauze from the crash cart in the hallway. 2 nurses were present. Earl Hutchins, who'd been called as Arthur's emergency contact, stood near the window with his arms crossed, and his face carrying the expression of the specific, focused anger that belongs to people who have decided they will not be moved. The money had been placed on the room's secondary bed by the night nurse, who had photographed it first, an instinct she would later say she couldn't explain, but that would prove invaluable. The ledger was on the side table, untouched, on Sarah's instructions. Miller surveyed the room. His eyes went to the ledger. Something crossed his face, too fast to read clearly, but present. "I'll need to take that into evidence," he said. He pointed to the ledger and the cash. "This appears to be connected to an ongoing investigation." "What investigation?" Sarah said. She was still on the floor beside Max, but she turned to look at Miller with eyes that held nothing deferential. "That's not information I can share with a civilian." Miller moved toward the side table. Earl Hutchins stepped between him and the ledger. "I don't think that's going to happen," Earl said. Miller's eyes moved to Earl with a flatness that was, briefly, entirely unmasked. "Sir, I am the county sheriff. Step aside." "Then act like it," Earl said. "Get a warrant." In the bed, Arthur stirred. His hand, the hand that had been resting, palm up, near where the bag had been placed, moved slightly, reaching toward a warmth that was no longer there. Leo had moved to the far side of the room, to Arthur's side of the bed, during the confrontation, an instinctive piece of positioning that Sarah registered and immediately understood. She'd known Leo from the few times he'd visited the shelter with Arthur, and she'd known him for what he was on the first meeting. "Leo," she said sharply, "step away from that bed." Leo looked at her with the expression of someone whose plan has been noticed before it can be executed, and he stepped back. But the oxygen line connecting Arthur's mask to the wall valve had been bumped during his passage, and the flow decreased momentarily, enough for the monitor to emit a sharp, single alarm. One of the nurses moved immediately to check the connection, securing it and resetting the alarm. She looked at Leo and said nothing, but her look said everything. Miller had used the distraction. He was at the side table, his hand on the ledger. "Don't." Sarah's voice cut across the room. She stood up from beside Max, her gloves red with blood. "Don't touch that. I have already notified the state police." The room went very, very quiet. Miller smiled. It was the preacher's smile, the politician's smile, the smile he'd worn for 20 years behind which he'd done 20 years of harm. "The state police," he said mildly. "Now why would you do that?" "Because," Sarah said, "I called them 45 minutes ago, when Max first came in, before anyone told me the money was here. Because a dog escaped from my shelter in the middle of the night, ran 12 miles in a blizzard, arrived covered in blood carrying a bag that smells like a buried hiding place, and went directly to the room of a man whose property you visited yesterday with a coercion document." She paused. "And because you're here, at 5 in the morning, in civilian clothes, 6 minutes after the police scanner call." Miller's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. He reached for the ledger. "Everyone step back," Miller said. His voice had lost the preacher's warmth entirely. What remained was something flat and technical, like a man reciting an operating procedure. "This is an active evidence seizure. Anyone who interferes is obstructing an officer of the law. No one moved. I will discharge this weapon if I need to, Miller said. The gun was not pointed at anyone directly. It was held low, angled toward the floor, but it was present and unmistakable. It was enough. The nurses backed against the wall. Earl Hutchins stood his ground for 3 full seconds, and then stepped back, because Earl Hutchins was brave, but he was 72 and he recognized the arithmetic of the situation. Sarah did not move. She stood between Miller and the side table with the ledger, and she kept her eyes on his face, and she thought about the phone in her coat pocket, the call that had connected to the state police dispatcher 30 minutes ago, the call that was, she hoped with everything she had, still open and recording. Miller stepped toward her. She did not step back. And then, from the floor beside the bed, a sound. Not a bark, not a growl. A sound lower than those things and older than those things. The sound a trained working dog makes in the half-second before it commits to an action. The subsonic vibration of pure, focused intent that a soldier learns to recognize as the sound that precedes certainty. Max rose. He did not rise gradually. He was on the floor, and then he was standing. Every one of his injuries sending their full report to his brain, information he was choosing, with complete deliberateness, to override. He stood between Miller and the bed, and his one amber eye was fixed on the gun with the absolute, professional clarity of an animal that had been trained to respond to exactly this. "Someone get control of that animal," Miller said. His voice remained level. The gun swung toward Max. From the bed, barely audible through the oxygen mask, a single word in a specific register. Low, even and certain. The register of a man who'd spent 30 years commanding soldiers and 3 years commanding a shepherd. The register that meant, "I see you. I trust you. I know exactly what you can do." Max. Max crossed the room in a single movement. His jaws closed on Miller's gun hand. The right wrist, the precise anatomical point that AK-9 handler spends months training a working dog to target. And he held on with the controlled, unrelenting pressure of 4 years of professional service and 3 years of something that training alone could never have produced. He did not shake his head. He did not tear. He held, and he braced his weight back, and he waited. The gun discharged once into the ceiling. Miller screamed and went to one knee. The gun hit the floor. The door crashed open. 4 state police officers, followed by 2 agents from the county attorney's investigation unit, who had been briefed on Sarah's 4:30 a.m. call and had been on the road for 90 minutes, came through the door. They took in the scene in the way trained people take in scenes, quickly, completely, without surprise, because they had been told what to expect and because experience had long since removed the capacity for it. Miller on one knee, a dog holding his gun hand, cash on a bed, a ledger on a side table, a man in a hospital bed, a woman standing between a corrupt sheriff and the evidence that would destroy him. "Release," the lead officer said to Max. Max looked at Arthur. Arthur, from the bed, gave a single small nod. Max released. He walked back to Arthur's bedside. He lay down on the floor with his head beside Arthur's dangling hand, and he closed his eye. Leo, who had been standing against the far wall with the specific stillness of a man hoping to be overlooked, was taken by the arm and walked out of the room. Miller was handcuffed on the floor of room 312 while his rights were read to him by a state police officer who did it with professional neutrality, which was, perhaps, the most insulting way it could have been done. The ledger was entered into evidence. The cash was entered into evidence. The agent from the county attorney's office, who had been the one Sarah had first reached at 4:30, leaned over the open ledger for approximately 30 seconds. Then he straightened up and said, to no one in particular, "This is going to be a very long week." Spring came to Millhaven County the way it always did in the mountains, reluctantly at first, a few degrees at a time, and then all at once, like a decision finally made. The snow was gone from the ridge road by late April. The pines had that particular new growth color at their tips that Arthur had always thought was the most specific shade of hope he knew of in the natural world. The vegetable garden, which Earl had tended through the winter at his own initiative, with the proprietorial kindness of old neighbors, had been turned and was ready to plant. Arthur sat in the rocking chair on the cabin porch and watched the light move across the valley. He was thinner than he had been, and he would be thinner for a while yet, because the treatment was still ongoing. Monthly visits to the university hospital in the state capital, where a team of oncologists had enrolled him in the same clinical trial he'd been told he couldn't afford. He was responding to it. Not dramatically, not with the sudden narrative efficiency of a film cure, but measurably, incrementally, in the way that real healing happens, in slow fractions, in returned appetites, in the progressive re-expansion of the days. Beside the rocking chair, Max lay stretched on the old wool blanket Arthur had put there for him, his chin on his front paws, his one amber eye half open in the satisfied and watchful rest of a dog that is exactly where it wants to be. He wore a collar that was different from the old one, new leather, hand-stitched, with a small silver medallion attached that bore the seal of the state police and the words, "Valor in Service, Maxwell K-9. The presentation ceremony had been brief and slightly absurd, conducted in a hospital corridor 6 weeks after the arrest, with Max sitting at rigid attention in the way that only military dogs sit, spine straight, eyes forward, every inch of him communicating a dignity that put the humans in the room to shame, and a very senior state police commander who had clearly never given a commendation to a German shepherd before navigating the proceedings with admirable composure. Sarah had cried. Earl had photographed everything on his phone with the expression of a man who had witnessed something he intended to remember for the rest of his life. Arthur had put his hand on Max's head and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. The accounting of Miller's crimes had taken 4 months and was not yet entirely complete. The ledger, 37 pages of meticulous record, kept with the careful arrogance of a man who believed he would never be caught, documented the systematic diversion of approximately $460,000 from the Millhaven Veterans Medical Assistance Fund over a period of 9 years. The fund had been established by county referendum in 2014 to provide supplemental health care coverage for veterans who fell through the gaps of federal benefits. Men and women exactly like Arthur. Exactly like dozens of others who had gone without treatment or delayed treatment or died before their time because the money earmarked for their survival had been redirected into Dale Miller's retirement accounts and his hunting property in the next county and a vacation home he'd told people he'd inherited from a distant relative. There had also been, on pages 22 through 29 of the ledger, something more serious. Documentation of payments made to a county coroner to alter findings in 3 cases involving veterans whose deaths had initially been flagged as suspicious. The state attorney's office had opened a separate homicide investigation. Miller was in county detention, without bail, and the preacher's smile had not been seen on his face since the morning in room 312 when a one-eared shepherd had reminded him that some things cannot be bought, seized, or silenced. Leo had pleaded guilty to charges of elder financial abuse and coercion. He was serving 18 months, which Arthur thought was insufficient but had stopped thinking about, because thinking about Leo took up space he decided to allocate to other things. The $60,000 recovered from the bag, combined with the seized assets from Miller's accounts, which the court had partially returned to the Veterans Fund on a priority basis, had paid for Arthur's treatment and then some. The county had additionally awarded him a $10,000 reward from the Public Integrity Fund, pressed by the state police commander who'd given Max his medal and who seemed to feel personally invested in how the story ended. Arthur had divided this money into 2 accounts, one for ongoing medical costs, and one that he directed Sarah to use for shelter operations, specifically for the housing and rehabilitation of retired working dogs who came back from service changed and difficult and not easily placed. "You know," Arthur said, to no one in particular, or rather, to the most particular audience imaginable. "Helen would have liked you." Max's ear swiveled. "She claimed not to be a dog person," Arthur continued. "For the first 12 years we were married. She maintained this position with considerable conviction. And then she found a stray on the road and brought it home inside her coat, and after that I had no illusions about her whatsoever." Max's tail moved once, slow and deliberate, against the blanket. "She would have made a complete fool of herself over you," Arthur said. "And you would have let her. You'd have let her think she was the one in charge, and then done exactly what you wanted." He paused, considering. "Actually, that's not unlike how things work between us." The afternoon light was gold across the valley, the kind of light that asks nothing of you and gives everything, the kind that exists in the gap between effort and arrival, when you can simply be in a place and have it be enough. A hawk turned long, slow circles above the tree line. The creek spoke to itself in the small language of moving water. Arthur reached down and put his hand on Max's side, felt the slow, even rise and fall of the dog breathing, felt the warmth of him, the specific and irreplaceable fact of him. Max shifted under Arthur's hand, pressing upward into the touch, the small, wordless vocabulary of a creature that has chosen its person and knows, with the certainty of instinct and experience both, that it has chosen correctly. 3 years ago, Arthur had walked away through a blizzard because he believed that love sometimes meant letting go. But the most decent thing he had left to give was his own absence. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in the specific way that people who love deeply and trust poorly are wrong. He had not understood that what he was to Max was not a circumstance to be managed or a resource to be rationed, but a fixed point in the universe, a thing as immovable as bearing, as non-negotiable as north. Max had not needed Arthur to save himself. Max could navigate a blizzard, outweed a hunter, carry 12 pounds of evidence through 5 miles of darkness, and walk through a hospital as though he'd been given the floor plan in advance. Max had needed Arthur to be found, and he had made it happen with his body and his blood and 4 years of training and whatever it is that lives in a dog that is not quite describable as love, but produces exactly love's results. The complete, unreserved commitment to another creature's survival that makes no calculation of cost and requires no reciprocation and asks for nothing in return except proximity. To be close, to be near, to be, against all odds and through all weather, there. The sun was going down behind the mountain, painting the valley in the colors of an apology, amber and rose, the sky doing something lavish and unnecessary and entirely welcome. Arthur Briggs and his dog sat together in the golden collapse of the day. The valley spread below them like something given rather than earned, and neither of them moved, because there was no reason to. They had already said everything that needed to be said. In a blizzard, in a hospital, in the long, daily, accumulating language of a hand resting on warm fur, of a dog pressed against an old man's leg on a mountain road in the dark, of 3 years of the particular grammar that exists between two broken things that have chosen each other and found, in the choosing, that they were less broken than they'd thought. Some bonds are not formed over time. They are tested over time. They were already there.